Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff. So here we are, and I will now begin the overview of Chapter 1. So just keep in mind, this brief lecture overview is not the entirety of the lecture. It's not a substitute for the lecture, but it is definitely helpful to have. So please make sure you listen to this, make sure you take notes, and if you have any questions, please post those questions, email those questions, or even ask those questions during, of course, what are called those Canvas conferences. Let us begin. So here we are in the first chapter, beginning in the textbook. I'm here on what I call page number 10. And as I am here in page 10, this is section 1.1, the origins of medical science. So when I think about the origins of medical science, the way in which we've gotten to where we are today is all based on that scientific method. And as I think about the scientific method, what I think about here and now is the way in which you have this hypothesis. Well, I'll take that back. The way in which you have those hypotheses, that alternative hypothesis, as well as, of course, the null hypothesis. As you use hypotheses, and it could be more than just one or two, it could be a number of alternative hypotheses. But as you use those and test those by way of experimentation, the process of science, how we've gotten to where we are today, into learning about the human body. So now what I'll get to is directly into, of course, the next section being section 1.2. As I've gotten to here, it's the namesake of the course. This is Human Anatomy and Physiology. So as that is, when I think of anatomy, I think of structure, meaning the form, meaning how this is in structure, or even the structure of, I guess I'll say, the human hand, or the structure of epithelial tissues, or even the structure of skeletal muscle. So when you think of anatomy, it's nothing more, of course, than the morphology or structure of that body part. Next, I'll get to physiology. If you're following along, I'm now on page 11. So with physiology, it deals, I would say, strictly with function. So as I always have taught it, I'll say it this way. Structure will always lend itself to function. So everything within the body has a specific structure, and with that specific set structure, everything within the body has a specific function, that physiological part of it. So keep those two in mind as we progress through the course, because I will lean on those throughout the course. In the textbook, make sure you also pay attention to the career corner. Here we have an EMT, the emergency medical technician. I won't read that portion to you, but do also review. And before I go too quickly throughout the textbook, I forgot one thing. Every chapter begins with understanding words. In a class like this, there are a number of words, and words you have not heard before, or words you may have heard before but may not quite well understand, and there could also be words that you cannot even pronounce. I say please pronounce those words well, and if you cannot pronounce those words, I am sure you have a cellular phone or smartphone somewhere somehow, and if you ask Siri or, I don't know, Cortana, or ask whoever it is, he or she can, of course, pronounce those words for you. So as they are there, make sure you know append, cardi, dors, homeo, peri, including pariet, and with that, pleur, stasis, and super. And those are not all of those, but just make sure you all do take time to review understanding words that begins each chapter. So I'll now continue on. Excuse me. And as I continue on now, I'll get to section 1.3 with levels of organization. So as those levels of organizations begin, we begin at the atom. So at the atom, of course, I like to think of the atom as being that is composed of those protons, neutrons, and electrons. It's these things that come together to, I say, compose what now is life at that organismal level. Not quite there, are we? So after we get to the subatomic particles that have now made up the atom, I call those atoms, or just those small parts, meaning they're made up of those subatomic particles. But atoms are those tiny parts that do retain, of course, those chemical properties of things, such as it states right there, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and even sulfur, not to mention nitrogen. So keep in mind that the atoms are there, made up of the things called the protons, neutrons, as well as electrons. So I'll now move on to what's next called the molecule. So at the molecular level, I think of those molecules being those small things that bond together, I now say covalently, to make up what is known as the macromolecule. So a lot of times I think of those molecules as being those inorganic things, that are, of course, bound by bonds, which, of course, could be covalent by way of those hydrogen bonds or even ionic bonds. So now at the macromolecule level, I like to think of these as being those basic building blocks for life in everything we do. As I put it in that way, in that vein, it's essentially what life is, meaning we could not live without, of course, the carbohydrates. We could not live without the lipids. And the same goes for proteins as well as nucleic acids. And those are the macromolecules. So going nextly, we're now at the organelle. So what those organelles are those pieces and parts, excuse me, that make up what is called the eukaryotic cell. So we being animals, of course, being this human anatomy and physiology course, I like to think of course, these organelles being important to allow our cells to, of course, be specific to, of course, their function. Oh boy, we're getting back to it being, of course, with both anatomy as well as physiology. So with those organelles, you think of organelles such as the nucleus. It, of course, is there with two membranes. And with those two membranes within is what is called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, one of the two types of nucleic acids. Going back to the macromolecules, it is. Excuse me, and with that, you have what is called the mitochondrion, which is there to synthesize adenosine triphosphate, known as ATP. Along the same vein, you also have the lysosome, which is there, and they sometimes are known as those, I guess we'll say, garbage disposals of the cell. And with that, you have the Golgi complex, the Golgi apparatus. And of course, you have that endomembrane system, which includes, of course, the endoplasmic reticulum, being, of course, that being smooth and rough. I'll stop there. Up next, of course, is the cell. So as I think about those cells, it is, excuse me, that basic structural and functional unit of us. So if there is life, there has to be at least one cell. I won't get political, but I like to think of someone that doesn't quite know what you all now know, meaning they don't know where life begins. So if there's at least one cell there, there is life. So those cells have become specialized, and groups of similar cells that carry out some specific function, of course, make up what is called the tissue. And of course, look at the tissues not long hereafter, and learning about those four basic types of animal tissues, being epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, as well as nerve tissue or nervous tissue. And then you have this tissue as well as that tissue, and even, of course, on tissue, meaning those groups of different tissues, they come together to, of course, make it what is known as the organ. So at the organ level, it's the organ that carries out, excuse me, I need to drink some water, that carry out some other function. So you may think of course, your skin being an organ. It's a major reservoir for the blood. Or even you may think of what is called your bone being, of course, an organ. And I'm saying all of these is because they have those differing tissues that, of course, are right there with them that function together. So I know I said bone, but when I think of bone, I'm thinking about what's within the bone itself. So you have not just that connective tissue, but you also, of course, have the nerve within the bone. And along that, excuse me, same way, we have the stomach that, of course, is a major organ within the body, not to mention, of course, the small intestine, and even, of course, the large intestine that's there in the body. And the very same could be said about, of course, the liver that's there, and even the pancreas that's there. And these are just a number of organs, and even, of course, the heart. So when you have those differing organs that are there working together for some common function, they'll to make up the organ system, such as the digestive system, such as the urinary system, such as the, excuse me, the respiratory system, and even, of course, the lymphatic system or the integumentary system. So all of those are just examples of organ systems, and then ultimately we're at the organismal level where we have all of those 11 organ systems of the body that make up you and they make up me. From here in your textbook, there is a table. It's called Table 1.1 on page 14 that reviews what you're seeing here. I use this lovely figure here as I went through those with you. And clinical application 1.1 will be a great thing for you all to review. Don't spend a lot of time there, but you all should review that. Where you will see about ultrasonography and, of course, the magnetic resonance imaging. And this will be, of course, a tale of two female patients. So from here, I'll move things on. So it mentions here the characteristics of life. So with life, there are a number of things that you must have to be alive. So then there before you, there are just a few things. It mentions their metabolism being a major component. And when I think of metabolism, I think of course, that sum of all of those chemical reactions in the body that make up us. So now I'll get to things that allow us to maintain life. It states the maintenance of life. So for us to be alive, we have to have, it states those basic 5 things. Firstly, it says water, which I mentioned not long ago. I need water now. But it's that most abundant substance in the body, and of course, it is that substance that underlies many of those bodily fluids and those secretions. So it states it's important for those metabolic processes. So when you think about those metabolic processes, those reactions many times will not occur without the addition of water. And then the very same way, some reactions, as they do occur, they of course give off water as a byproduct. So just keep in mind that because of the water within you and the water within me, it's able to, of course, allow us to not change our body temperatures too easily. And just think about it in such a way. I don't have any bottles in here. Oh boy. But if there was a vessel of water that could hold maybe that much water, I would hope that you would agree that a vessel that was this size would take much more energy to heat just 1 degree Celsius compared to, of course, a vessel that was that volume of water. And the very same is because that's with us. So since we have so much water within our bodies, our temperature does not fluctuate much at all. Thanks a lot, water, and of course, homeostasis. We'll get there later. Next up, of course, is food. Class, you've got to eat. There was a commercial that said, gotta eat. I think there was a commercial by, well, I won't say the place. But what I will say is without eating, class, you all could die. So please make sure that you all are eating and eating well. And of course, ingesting a sufficient amount of water. So by way of eating, of course, what you then do is take in those major building blocks for life. I'm referring to the carbohydrates, the lipids, and of course, the proteins. And from here, after food, is the gas called oxygen. Without oxygen, class, you die. So next up is heat. So what heat does is ensures that our body temperature does not change so drastically. So as I move right now, I'm getting warmer myself, but that's what occurs because our skeletal muscles, they make copious amounts of heat. And lastly, of course, is that atmospheric pressure. So the pressure that is here allows us to breathe. So you say breathe, yes, by taking in air, and of course by letting the air go. It requires absolutely no energy. And the same being the hydrostatic pressure that allows blood to, of course, be pumped by way of the heart. And yes, the heart, that was once by someone told me, that upside down house right there at that apex is nothing more than a pump, pumping, of course, the blood to the body. And from here, we'll now get to homeostasis. And I have a note in my textbook. I'm here on page 16. I was on page 15 into 16. I forgot to tell you about those page numbers. But as I am here on page 16, I made a note to myself to see the abdominopelvic quadrants and regions. Those are on page 32. We'll get there shortly. But since the note is my text, I'll say please make sure that you all review the abdominopelvic quadrants and regions. I'll get back to that here shortly. So now at homeostasis. This will be a major component of your first lecture test, being test 1 on chapters 1 and 2. And we're here throughout chapter 1 and almost finished with it. So when I think of homeostasis, I think of it being the way in which the body keeps those things, meaning it allows us to remain alive. And it keeps those things within the body, within those very narrow limits, no matter what's going on. Meaning the body is always being challenged, I say. You say challenged by what? I say being challenged by you. And if you're wondering how, it may be by you skipping a meal, or even by you eating too much within that meal. But all day and night, we're challenged. Even right now, I said I was getting warm, but I am actually getting a bit cool too, because throughout the night, of course, the temperature in the house gets, of course, lower and lower and lower. And of course, I'm standing here now, and I'm getting pretty cool. So what the body does is, no matter what's going on, it's right there with those stressors, ensuring that we remain alive. So to follow along with me on page 16, keep in mind how homeostasis operates. So we have these things called homeostatic mechanisms. So the homeostatic mechanisms are the way in which those things within the body are kept within those narrow limits. So take time, and I hope that you all have gone through this by now, and if you have not, after this, or even right now with me, just pause or rewind and go through it with me. So I'll begin now. And if you don't get it, just pause it and then go backwards. I'll begin. So what happens is, the way in which homeostasis operates is by those variables. And I don't teach math, I hope it's obvious. I love biology, I love anatomy and physiology. So what I'm getting at here is that variables change. I had a math teacher, oh boy, I had a number of math teachers. But as I think back to those math teachers that taught me, they taught me that those things called variables, they change. So since those variables change, what happens is by way of homeostasis, it operates to keep each and every one of those variables within those narrow limits, as I just mentioned. So as it happens, we have those three components of the homeostatic mechanism as you all see being displayed. So first things first, it's called the receptor. At the receptor level, what happens there is it's there to detect the change that has occurred, whether that change is in blood glucose level, whether that change is in the blood volume, whether the change is in what I call, I guess I'll just go along with blood pressure, whether that change is, I guess I'll say body temperature. Whatever the change might be in that variable, it's the receptor that's there to detect whether that has changed and gotten, of course, I say above the set point, or that change has gotten, of course, lower than, so I say below the set point. So since I said the word set point, I'll define a set point as being that homeostatic value that, of course, those variables have to be at for you all to remain, for us to remain at homeostasis. So as it happens, I have a new term coming. The new term now is going to be from that receptor. Then that information will go along the AFF, the afferent pathway. I said AFFERENT, along the afferent pathway to the control center. So it's the control center that's there to do what is called that twofold role. Let's begin. So the control center does two things. The two things that the control center does are A, it sets the appropriate set point, meaning whatever that value may be for this variable, for that variable, for all the variables that make up you, that make up me. The control center is what sets the set point. And B, the control center also determines the appropriate means for the response to any deviation from that set point. So now we'll get to that third component, being the effector. So what happens is, from the receptor, information was sent along the afferent pathway to the control center. Now from this control center, as it's noticed a deviation, be it above that set point or of course below that set point, it now sends that information along the efferent pathway, that's EFFERENT, along the efferent pathway to what is called the effector, and the effector is what provides that means for the response. That is, I guess I'll say, what homeostasis is and homeostatic mechanisms in a nutshell. So using what I just did with my hands, I think you can now see where I'm going. I'll now continue. So when you had your first test, you will be tasked with, of course, providing an example of negative feedback and explaining how it operates, and providing an example of positive feedback and how it operates. So I'll begin now with, excuse me, what is negative feedback? Let us begin. So as negative feedback is described, wow, this is an example of negative feedback mechanisms. What negative feedback does is it reverses the change in that original stimulus and returns it back to homeostasis. And I guess I'll stay here for just a few moments, and I'm glad I'm stopping here. Make sure that on your lecture test, being test 1, make sure you all do not, please, I say make sure you all do not, please, do not use a thermostat set point. I gave a test, and not just once or twice, but a number of times I've seen the test, it being used at this thermostat example. That is not at all, of course, what I call anatomy and physiology of the human body. So please make sure your example rests upon, of course, something within the human body. Let us begin. So when I think of negative feedback systems, a negative feedback system is a system that will stop or shut off that original stimulus that caused the deviation from the set point and return it back to homeostasis. For example, let's just go with people being thankful. I don't know why I said that. Well, I do know why I said that. Sometimes people are thankful. I did say sometimes. And as people are thankful sometimes, what they do is maybe eat cake. They maybe eat pie. They may eat, I don't know, whatever they eat, cake, pie. I have no other examples. But what I'm going to, of course, is a Thursday in November in which people are thankful on Thanksgiving. So sometimes I like to eat cake. In fact, I had a bit of cake today. It was amazing. And let's just say I ate too much cake. What would be the, I guess I'll say, effect of eating too much cake? It would, of course, change things. What it would change, I say especially, would be my blood glucose levels. Let's begin. So prior to cake, I would say I was likely at homeostasis. I said likely at homeostasis. So what had happened was, I did just say that, is that by ingesting that cake, it of course increased my blood glucose levels. So what happens then is that was that stimulus for change that caused a change in my blood glucose. So what would happen is the receptor, being of course those beta cells of the pancreas, which are there to detect the change in my blood glucose, would state, okay, they have changed, meaning they being, of course, the blood glucose levels. So it would send that information along the afferent pathway to the control center, being the hypothalamus. It's in the brain, you all, the hypothalamus. I repeat, the hypothalamus is the control center. So what would then happen is the hypothalamus, which has set that set point to be that approximate 70 to 110 milligrams of glucose per deciliter. I just said again, the hypothalamus, which is in the brain, which determined that set point for blood glucose, which should be that approximate 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. It's noticed now it's no longer there within that range. Since I had so much cake, my blood glucose is now an approximate 200 milligrams per deciliter. Far higher than 110 milligrams per deciliter. So, since the hypothalamus is there to, yes, set that set point, I said earlier, it also determines the appropriate response. So now along the efferent pathway, of course, it will now go to what are called the beta cells of the pancreas to allow those beta cells of the pancreas to secrete insulin, to, of course, break down that blood glucose, because, of course, my blood glucose was far, I say, too high. So the blood glucose will then be broken down by way of the insulin released from the beta cells of the pancreas. And then, of course, it should then allow me to get back to what is called homeostasis. And with that, one thing I didn't think of would be the formation of glycogen from that excess glucose within me. But of course, this would get me back to homeostasis. In another example, meaning on your test I'll ask for one example, but I like giving two examples. Let's just say I was hot, meaning the body temperature, my body temperature, hot. Right now it's, I guess I'll say, June. So since it's now June, it's now hot here in Alabama. So if you're standing outside in Alabama, you're I'll say sweating. Your clothes are likely sticking to you. Thanks a lot, humidity. So what will then happen is my thermoreceptors are here to detect that change in temperature. Thermoreceptors are there to detect the change in temperature. So they would send that information to, of course, the hypothalamus by way of the afferent pathway. What would then happen, of course, is the hypothalamus would say, okay, we ought to be at that approximate 98 degrees Fahrenheit. You're no longer there. So it would send that information, of course, by way of the efferent pathway, of course, to those effectors. So we would know then, all right, it's time for us to sweat. So, of course, the sweat glands will, of course, secrete sweat to have that evaporative cooling effect. The very same way, vasodilation would occur. I repeat, vasodilation would occur to allow my blood vessels to, of course, expel heat, and the heat that is within the blood. So you now have two examples. You now have two examples to, of course, provide for negative feedback. Up next is positive feedback. So with positive feedback, please, class, as I mentioned moments ago, please do not use speakers, a microphone, and an amplifier on the test. So with positive feedback, I say the difference here is there is some change or some deviation at set point. And what positive feedback does is it intensifies that change. And I say it intensifies that change, and of course it causes that set point, it causes that variable to get further and further away from homeostasis. Let's get to an example. So in the example of positive feedback, I'd like to think of that pregnant woman. Not that I know one right now, but what I'm thinking about is during pregnancy, a woman, of course, well, is with child. And at some point, labor begins. As labor begins, likely because, of course, the child's head has reached the cervix, it triggers a cascade effect. That cascade effect is taking that woman, I say, further and further away from homeostasis. So as the baby's head reaches the birth canal, it will cause hormone known as oxytocin to be released. It would trigger, of course, those reflexive contractions of the uterus to, of course, eventually expel the child through the birth canal. So the case is that positive feedback could be potentially fatal. It's there for those infrequent events. Another example with positive feedback would be, of course, getting cut. Sometimes we all get cut, and if you have any trouble with cutting yourselves or knows of anyone cutting themselves, I would say let me know and I'll find them help because I care about you all, even though I don't know you all name by name, being, of course, the first day of class. But to get back to where I'm going is, when there is a break in the blood vessel, and of course bleeding begins, there will be chemicals that will be released. And those chemicals that are released will cause platelets to, of course, go to that site of that tear in the blood vessel. So those platelets will release even more chemicals to be causing even more platelets to come until, of course, the platelet plug has been formed. And, of course, that should cease and, of course, stop the platelets to, of course, come to that area. But as I mentioned a moment ago, positive feedback could be potentially fatal. And I say potentially fatal because, of course, if that blood clot happens to, of course, occlude a vessel, that could lead to, of course, death. And the very same way is, in the event that a blood clot happens to travel, being, of course, an embolism, especially to the lungs, being a pulmonary embolism, it could, of course, kill someone. So keep in mind, those are them and them are those. So I'll ask you, what is homeostasis? I'll ask you, what is that rule of set points? I'll also ask you about the receptor level, the control center level, and the effectors. And then I'll ask what is negative feedback. I'll ask what is positive feedback. And then you will explain one example of each of those, being negative and positive feedback, respectively. And that's on your test, you all. Write it down. Prepare to write about it. All right. So now that we've done each of these, I want to keep on going. And these presentations are there at Canvas for you all. Use them as much as you all need. Now to where I was just moments ago with anatomical position. So as I mentioned anatomical position here, this is on page 32 in the text. I'm going to turn my book to page 32 here. I hope that you have your book out as well. So I mentioned anatomical position because this is what is used in the medical field. And I would imagine that if you're taking this class, there is a medical field career not too far in your distant future, or at least not so far into the distant future of yourselves. So I think you get what I'm saying. So anatomical position is referring to that patient being, of course, facing forward, and of course with those palms also facing forward, and of course I say those toes being there, and everything is referenced to this known position. So this is used, I say, everywhere on earth, from that EMT I mentioned earlier at the career corner, to that physician there at that table, even in surgery, and just even in the clinic with, of course, the nurses. Keep these in mind, because anatomical position is, I would say, why not just you are here, but I say why we are all here. So next up it mentions, let's just go on down to the organization of the human body. So it mentions the axial portion of the body. And when it refers to axial, axial just refers to the head, neck, and trunk, as opposed to the appendicular portion being, of course, by and large, your upper and lower limbs. So I'll now get to the major cavities of the axial portion. So that includes what is known as the cranial cavity, the vertebral canal or spinal cavity, the thoracic cavity, and then the abdominopelvic cavity. You'll spend more time on these during lab, not so much during the lecture. So with that, I'll move on from those major body cavities, meaning you'll do more with this by way of lab than you'll do during a lecture. But the diaphragm is what separates the two, being the abdominopelvic cavity as well as the thoracic cavity. So from here, I'll get on down to the photo showing such from page 21 of the textbook. And I won't deal so much with the small cavities of the head, such as the middle ear cavity, the orbital cavities, the nasal, and of course the oral cavity. But I did all of those to get to the thoracic and abdominopelvic membranes. So this is where it gets quite important. So these serous membranes that you all will find in your textbook beginning on page 22 are majorly important. So these serous membranes, they secrete that slippery serous fluid. So what happens is our organs have to move. And if you're wondering why they have to move, well, sometimes you eat. I'm kidding. You should eat, I say more than just sometimes. Have a snack. Not to just because I said have a snack. But what I'm getting at is your heart. It's moving all the time. If it happens to have stopped, well, you likely have died or gone through an arrest from cardiac arrest. So what happens is, keeping in mind that the visceral layer is that layer that covers the organ itself. Visceral covers the organ, whereas the parietal layer is what's on the outside, on the wall of the cavity. So parietal on the wall, visceral on the organ itself. So between the two is what is called that serous fluid. So it allows that organ to move and to not cause any friction and to not become inflamed. So examples of such things are as follows, such as the visceral pleura. I say pleura, I'm referring to the lung. Or the parietal pleura, referring to, of course, that there. And, of course, between that visceral pleura and the parietal pleura would be that serous fluid. And the same, of course, you'll find for the visceral pericardium or the parietal pericardium and the serous fluid that's within to allow that heart to, of course, beat and beat and beat and beat and never stop beating. And then, of course, the same could be said about, of course, the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. So from here, I'll now get to what is on page 32, which I got to, I guess, a little quick. So here it shows you all what are called the abdominopelvic regions and quadrants. So on the test, what you'll be tasked with doing is to list those 9. I say to list those 9 abdominal pelvic regions. To list those 9 regions. So list all 9 abdominal pelvic regions. And then, of course, you will, well, I'll take that back. Label the 9 abdominal pelvic regions. But of course, you are listing them. But you'll label all 9 abdominal pelvic regions. And you'll do the same with those abdominal pelvic quadrants. There are 4 of those, such as the right upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, the left lower quadrant, and of course the left upper quadrant. Keeping in mind anatomical position class. And with that, you will also provide 3 organs, or you will provide 3 organs per quadrant on your lecture test. So with that, class, this has been the lecture. I'll spend just a few moments here on the organ systems, not many moments. So the integumentary system, we have an entire chapter on this. It covers and protects the body. Also, it is here, class, to synthesize what is known as vitamin D. The very same way it helps with the regulation of temperature, class, because your blood is within, of course, in the skin of you, because it serves as a major reservoir for the blood. Next up is the skeletal system. It does protect, but it also, class, serves as a reservoir, class, for calcium salts, within which, class, the red marrow, we make what are called blood cells, meaning it's adult stem cells that are there and produces, of course, the white blood cells and red blood cells. And the very same way, class, is an attachment point, class, for skeletal muscle. Up next is the muscular system. We'll go through that chapter, class, not many days from here in chapter 9. But of course, it allows us to move, class, and produces copious amounts of heat. Up next, class, is the nervous system. We have chapters on that. Chapter 10, 11, and 12, class, they are on the nervous system. I won't spend much time here, class, on those. What I will get to next, class, is the endocrine system. It is the smallest system in the body class, which I always say could fit in the palm of your hand. All of those endocrine organs, think of that system. But without class any of those, which you will likely class have some disorder or disease. Up next is the cardiovascular system, which won't be taught in this course. That will be saved class for Human Anatomy and Physiology 2. But of course, the major pump that's their class pumps body class blood throughout the body. And of course, those vessels are there to, of course, transport the blood class both to and fro. The very same way class wastes can be gotten rid of class by way of the cardiovascular system. Nextly is the lymphatic system class. By way of that lymphatic system, of course, it keeps you class and me alive. And yes, that's my dog Coco class beside me. So the digestive system class is next. So it's here class to allow you all to get those macromolecules from those things class you do indeed eat. So as we break down those foodstuffs class, eventually class that we cannot eat by way of the large intestine class will of course leave the body. From here class we get to the respiratory system. It allows us to class exchange gas. And from here class we go to the urinary system. And it's by way of that urinary system class that we, of course, excrete those wastes. Primarily, I say those nitrogenous wastes, but it also class allows you, of course, to either A, get rid of class that excess water, or B class, reuptake class the water you may need because you do not need class, don't need to get rid of too much water. Thanks a lot, ADH, the anti-diuretic hormone. And then lastly, class is that reproductive system. And it's because of these class that you and I are here, allowing, of course, us to go from generation 1 to generation 2, if I can say it in such a way. In the meantime, class, please make sure you all study very well. This has been an overview class of the chapter, and if I can ever help you, class, please let me know. This has been your instructor, Skylar Huff, and I look forward, class, to hearing from you all with questions that you all may have about this that is called Chapter 1. Thank you and have a great evening.